Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good.
Good. Excellent.
This is Paul Mason, and my name is Jazza. Hello, Internet. Nice to see you again. Paul is economics editor for Channel 4 News, but is also prolific in writing many things in the form of books and also articles in publications across the UK. He recently put out a documentary called This Is a Coup, which documents the rise of Syriza, the left-wing anti-austerity party that came to power recently in Greece. Particularly, there's a lot of stuff in that documentary that expresses the Greek feeling of frustration towards countries like Germany and to the EU as a whole. And I would urge you to watch that, you can see it here, and then perhaps come back and listen to our conversation that we're going to have about the documentary. This is again a long-term interview that I did with him. Feel free to put it on in the background and have a listen to what we have to say. He's an incredibly intelligent man, and I had some great chin-wagging with him. If you'd like to see more politics and stuff like this, because I know I've ended up being more of an LGBT channel recently, then let me know in the comments below. Shall we continue with the interview? Yes, we shall. On we go.
Your documentary is amazing. Like, it's really well made. It makes some amazing points, and it puts across a viewpoint within Greece that I don't think many people on this side of Europe really get to hear very much, which is like super important. There are some things that, seeing the way that the rest of the EU is talked about, that did raise some concerns with me, specifically some of the language that is thrown about, understandably, because people are very frustrated. There's certain people who refer to Merkel as Hitler's descendant. Angela is told to suck many people's balls. And you yourself call it an economic war. Do you worry about the tone of that language in terms of the potential cohesiveness of Europe as like a peaceful society?
Look, what you have to realise is that in the 1940s, Germany invaded Greece. It killed 60,000 Jews, and 600,000 people died of starvation in a country of maybe less than 10 million. There are people still alive who lived through that, who were told that their pensions were no longer going to be paid because Germany had insisted on it. And so to them, remember, in the intervening period, the left in Greece, which is not tiny as it is in Britain, it's about 30% of the population. You served your military service in a snake pit, whereas a rich person serves their military service in a cocktail bar. You are banned from academia. You are banned from the civil service. This is 2 generations of people. They thought they'd thrown all that off. They thought they joined Europe, they were an equal member of this club called Europe, and prosperity came. It was a disaster because their own elite ripped off the country. And that was their fault, that's the Greeks' fault. But for Germany to walk in and say, and because of that you have to starve again. Because let's remember, we're not talking about here, when I say starving as a kind of metaphor, I mean starving. I mean, people had their electricity switched off because they didn't pay their taxes. So 200,000 people were without electricity. I only have to record what reality, not make it, not have an opinion on it. But the reality is you'll find many, many working class people in Greece, and especially old people, very unembarrassed about drawing the parallel between what the Nazis did to Greece and what Germany has done this year.
Do you ever worry about that, though? So I kind of understand...
What's to worry about?
Because I think that if somebody here were to start talking about Germany as Nazis again and calling Angela Merkel the second coming of Hitler, I think that we would probably have an outraged response to that as a community.
Clearly, Merkel is not the second coming of Hitler.
No, of course not. And she's got much better hair, for one
Europe
thing.
is not a Fourth Reich, and etc., etc. But there is an issue. There is an issue for those of us who've studied German history, as I have, that goes beyond Hitler and the Nazis, about Germany's repeated ability in history to be obsessed with rules to the exclusion of human outcomes. This is something that very respectable historians, not crazy people on the street shouting, but very respectable historians have observed about German society, and there's a debate about it. But I think when I saw Greek people get really, really angry with Germany, I understood why. Because...
Do you think it's justified the way that they feel?
I think Europe, not just Germany, Northern Europe, Lithuania, Estonia, the Netherlands. These were countries that insisted on basically smashing Greek democracy. I think that's what's happened. Let's make no bones about it. People in Greece voted for A, Europe imposed B or Z. So look, I am worried about the cohesion of Europe. I'm really worried about nationalistic sentiment that says you're descended from Hitler, you're a bunch of lazy people in Greece. I'm really worried about that. We should not encourage it. But as a journalist, what you can't do is you can't turn your lens away from it. You can't say, if only this were better. Let's just interview some nice people. And also, if something is representative, there's a woman in the documentary who says, I fought at the age of 17 in a civil war. She's clearly in her 80s now. She, to me, doesn't have an equal right with some kind of .com young person in a Primark outfit. Yeah, she has a bigger right to be heard because she did fight in a civil war in her own country, and probably her friends was fighting the Nazis. They have a right to be heard. The Indignado movement in 2011 was inspired, actually, by the writings of anti-fascist resistors from the Second World War. We must remember what goes wrong when one country decides it can dictate to another. We must remember it.
There was a really interesting exchange between two subjects of the documentary as well. An older man, probably in his 40s or 50s, probably in his 50s or 60s, actually, talking with what we would describe as millennials. I hate that word for several reasons. But he was saying, I've worked hard my whole life.
Yeah.
And that goes along with what you've been saying is Greeks aren't lazy people. They've clearly, they work long hours and they have paid into the society and they expect something back when they are preparing for retirement. But there's also kind of like this man in that moment, rather than turning on the Germans, is turning on the millennials who he thinks are scrounging and who are lazy. But how is there a possible way, and is there a future perhaps in Europe where we don't blame the other? Because I feel like here we have a strong right in terms of UKIP, who are very happy to blame everything on immigrants, whereas over there it seems to be everything is the fault of Germany. Where's the responsibility?
Well, to be fair, the first thing they'll say is everything's the response of the first thing they'll say is that everything's the fault of their own corrupt rich elite. That's the first thing that Greeks will say. And they tried to fight that rich elite, and it turned out that Germany and Northern Europe, not just Germany, intervened on the side of that rich elite. So I don't think there is an otherisation, but you have to bear in mind, we can't make the world simple and nice, although we would like it to be simple and nice. This is a country that had a civil war, whose losing side, the left, were punished for it for 2 generations. And what they're supposed to do, forget that. No, they won't forget it. And in other words, for them, the biggest other in Greece, for both sides, is other Greeks. And it is literally the right-wing tradition and the left-wing tradition. And what I say to people watching the documentary, especially young people who would love it if everybody was calm and rational and humane, is that these crisis situations actually do bring out these horrible
side of humanity.
Well, it's a horrible side, but ultimately, if you have to fight, you have to win. Yeah, you want to win. And what happened, the real danger in Greek society that's evidenced by this documentary is that under pressure, Greeks started to fight each other who hadn't really found it they hadn't been very antagonistic before. And I'm talking about the middle class and the left were really facing each other on the streets at a point where both sides, I think, understood, shit, this could go too far.
Yeah.
So, yes, the documentary shows that. But I'll just repeat, you cannot turn your lens away from reality. If reality is a bunch of people very angry against Germany, that's reality to me.
So I think that's interesting, because a part that I've seen in the documentary shows the result of a Greek, what was it called? It was a Greek kind of like committee that said that the debt that was imposed upon Greece was unlawful and odious. And and it should probably be pointed out that it was a committee chaired by Syriza, so they clearly have an agenda there. Yeah. How can you... And I'm not necessarily asking you to justify this, but how can Syriza and the people who vote for Syriza justify the erasure of that debt to somebody who is just a normal citizen, not a politician in Brussels, but a normal citizen in Finland or Germany that is going to end up having to pay this money back on behalf of the Greeks.
So you have to rewind, and you have to look at when Greece was given the money. It's something in excess of 300 billion euros, to bail them out, to stop them going bankrupt. 89% of that money was recycled straight back to save the banks of France, Germany, the Netherlands. Some British banks were saved by that bailout. It was so bad that the people in charge had let the Greek economy become so indebted that if it had blown up, it would have taken down the banking system of Northern Europe. Now, in other words, the bailout was to save our banks, not to save Greece. 11% of the money went to save Greece, and the price of it was to do what? To destroy their economy. So the first thing to say is that we all benefited from the Greek bailout and the Greeks didn't. I think that's the first thing I would say to anybody who says, why should we care? There are banks still open in Germany, Netherlands, Austria today that would be shut and people would lose their savings if we hadn't have bailed out Greece. But ultimately, the debt of Greece and many other countries is just unpayable. I just think we need to get real and understand that when your debt is 200% of your GDP, which is what Greece is headed for right now, that is not payable. So somebody's going to have to suffer. The people who lent it will suffer.
How do you justify that to the person who suffers then?
Because the alternative is somebody else suffers. And I think...
So what makes a Greek person's life better than a German person's
life? See, everybody in economics will say, it would be better if the Greek economy recovered. Okay, because, look, it's all been very benign now, that maybe 500,000 Syrians and Afghans come through Greece, they go to Macedonia, fine. Okay, if you can imagine a very nasty outcome to that. You can imagine Greek society collapsing. You can imagine Europe's border with Asia collapsing. That nobody in Germany is going to like that. Nobody in Britain will like that if it happens. If Greece were to go fascist, you wouldn't like that. If Greece were to have a military coup, as happened in the 70s, you wouldn't like that. So it's about realpolitik. It's about being pragmatic. About when debt is unpayable, you can't go on pretending it's payable. You have to put right the problem. Now, who would lose money? The state. Who would lose money? The German state, the French state, the Netherlands state. Yeah, that's who would really lose money. Can they take a hit? We know the German state can take a hit because it just voluntarily asked 900,000 Syrians to come and live in Germany.
Yeah.
So when it wants to, a strong state like Germany can do anything it wants, especially when it's debt write-off. Debt write-offs are to a penny. You know, most of what we call developing countries, third world countries, had their debt substantially written off in the 1990s.
Is that not just proportionately because their economies are much smaller, though?
Well, Greek economy is small. It's just its debt's huge.
but then we do, like, everybody freaks out about it, and there's loads of stuff on the internet that shows how actually relatively small the Greek economy is, but it's because of the link with the euro that makes everybody freak the hell out. And it is like Wall Street and the FTSE, who are the people that freak out about it and then make it into a huge catastrophe.
Most people on Wall Street want the Greek debt to be restructured. It's not written off, but it's basically say, look, it's like if I owe you £100, I say I can't pay it. You've got two choices. You can make me bankrupt, in which case I'm going to pay you nothing, or let me pay you 60. Okay, that's what people on Wall Street do. That's what people in the City of London do all the time. And they say, well, next time you borrow, it's going to cost you more, so don't be borrowing again very, very soon. But yeah, we can probably do a deal. This is how finance actually works. So it's not, in this case, it is not Wall Street that insisted on this. It is the German, French and Netherlands political elites that didn't want to lose face over the money that they'd lent to Greece to lend back to their own banks. I think, we must be realistic about country finance. Some countries have debt so big that it could tank the world, let alone the country. Japan, yeah? America has a debt, what is it now? $17 trillion debt. Anybody who thinks that's ever going to be repaid is just fantasising. So the future...
But nobody's talking about writing off the US's debt, are they?
Well, you say that, but exactly some of the members of Congress who are the most bullish about this do in fact argue there's plenty of ways you can write off debt. You can make your own currency deplete against another currency. There's lots of tactics you can do to make your debt smaller and somebody else have the problem. I think we're in a century where debt is going to... There's going to be a moment, people will live through it, maybe it's not going to be in the next 10 years, when a lot of these debts will be written off, because all we know from history is that there were massive debts at the end of World War II, and through inflation and write-offs and defaults, so when you won't pay your debt, they got whittled down to about 30% of world GDP from 100. That's what happened. If we don't do that again... Are we
at the equivalent of the end of World War II, though?
We are at the end of the equivalent of World War II in debt terms without having a war. I mean, the debts of World War II were run up by war, by having to build Spitfires, yeah? We've run up, as a world, debts equivalent to that just by having a financial crisis. And, yeah, they're going to have to be... Everybody sensible knows there's got to be some restructuring of the global debt. Greece just got the sticky end of the lollipop, that's a technical financial term, because it happened to have the wrong kind of government who everybody hated, and that was a government that for once was not corrupt and that represented ordinary people, and that was too much for the Europeans.
I want to throw something your way and accuse you slightly of the fact that you have very clear bad guys in the documentary in terms of like the EU and Germany.
Yeah. They're not bad guys, but they're people who don't ever appear, funnily enough. We didn't interview them.
Yeah. So. But basically, I think that there's there's another side to this coin that kind of doesn't accuse, but also shines light on the fact that Greece has quite a dodgy culture when it comes to like taxation.
It's more than dodgy. It's more than quite. It's very dodgy.
So how much of that does fall on? So something like €30 billion euros a year is avoided in tax in Greece. How much of that is? How much of this is of this kind of phenomenon in terms of the Greek debt is actually their fault, and how much do they need to sort out their own backyard?
Well, they massively need to sort out their own backyard, and what you can't accuse Syriza of is avoiding that. They came to power saying, we will take down the oligarchy, we will tax them, we will force contracts to be awarded legally rather than somebody's brother's got a building firm. Yeah, we're going to do all of that. They weren't the only party. There are other parties in Greece that said they were going to do that. They didn't get the chance to do it. So, yes, I think you have to realise that there's not just a quite dodgy culture, there is an utterly and profoundly corrupt culture in Greece. It just so happens that as long as their friends were in power, the Europeans didn't care about it. In fact, they'll invite these guys to dinner to Davos, to the World Economic Forum, to anything you want to go to, as long as you're playing the game. The moment you're not playing the game, it doesn't matter whether you're corrupt or honest, that's when you run into it. And this is why, to me, the interesting thing is, no matter how pernicious we see Greek corruption as, and Greek tax evasion, not just avoidance, by the elite, it is. But you always come back down to the fact that it didn't seem to bother Europe when there was a right-wing government. It was only when there was a left-wing government committed to fighting oligarchy and corruption that the Europeans tried to stop it.
Is the difference not the crisis, though, rather than the change of government?
I think the change of government really did scare Europe. It scared Europe because the first time you had a party that was clean hands, young people, clearly connected to the people.
Who didn't want to pay back the debt that it owed the rest of Europe.
Who didn't want to pay that debt it owned the rest of Europe. Again, that would scare them. And they had popular support. So Tsipras says in the documentary, they did what they did to me to stop it happening in Spain, to stop it happening in Portugal, and to stop it happening ever in Britain, if Britain got a left-wing government. I think that is a plausible scenario. I don't think all the Europeans thought the same way, though, because as we were covering it, Syriza were convinced, we, the journalists who covered it, were convinced that Obama, Hollande, the President of France, Renzi, the Prime Minister of Italy, were saying all the time, it'll all be fine, we'll sort it out. In the end, they had no power when the most powerful country in Europe, Germany, said, no, we're not going to sort it out, we want to defeat you. And they did defeat them. And as we've discussed, the big cultural problem therein is it wasn't France and it wasn't America who invaded Greece in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
It was Germany, and there are people still alive who have nightmares about that.
Mm-hmm.
And to them, it seemed very ironic.
I know that you have to go. I would love to. I'm going to ask.
Do one more.
I'd love to ask you one more.
Go on.
Excellent. So we've seen in
Just one more, yeah?
we've seen in the no.
Yeah.
There's a distinct difference, I feel, in the north of Europe and in the south of Europe in terms of where people seem to be turning for an answer post-crisis.
Yeah.
So the southern states, we see a rise of Podemos in Spain. We've got Syriza in power in Greece. And then in the north, we see the National Front having their biggest turnout in the regional elections in France.
Yeah.
We have fascist groups in the Netherlands, and we have UKIP rising in the
Finland,
UK.
the true Finns, they're not fascist,
Completely.
but they're right wing.
What's happening in terms of like the difference here? Because the north is very much turning to the right and to those kinds of economic answers, and the left is turning, and the south is turning to the left.
I think that might be too simplistic. I think it might be too simplistic.
Go on, destroy it.
No, because Southern Europe has a lot of right wing people in it, and it just so happens that Southern Europe has been suffered disproportionately from the austerity that the whole of Europe has imposed on itself. I think the Eurozone has become the Eurozone has become a machine for creating jobs a little bit in Germany and destroying them in Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain. So people are going to look to the extremes of politics, and I think we can't, as journalists, just sit there saying how terrible. Because otherwise, that means the world as it is perfect. As journalists, you've got to say why are they doing it, and what is the outcome? Now, the outcome in Greece was they turned to the left, and that government was smashed. We don't know what the next thing's going to be. The one set of people who are really, really strongly still opposing austerity are the fascists. They held up the Oki posters in Parliament. Everybody else walked out. We don't know where Greece goes. In North Europe, I think it's too simplistic to say that the North European people are moving to the right. In actual fact, most of these, they're not fascist, but far right-wing conservative nationalism seems to peak round about 25%, and it seems to draw a lot of support from working-class people who've lost their jobs, but
who aren't yet serviced by modern political parties.
They are not the world. They are not the whole world. The Salariat, the centrist Salariat, is very strong. The youth, in general, are not going in that direction. So I don't think North Europe fascist, South Europe communist is a thing. I think it's far more complicated, and there's many, many more years to play out, because centrist politics is resilient. Look at Germany, look at France. Centrist politics is the majority, because people can negotiate their way around austerity as long as it's not severe. The severe austerity in Greece is 25% fall in GDP versus 4% fall in Ireland. They're virtually identical in terms of the problems they have.
Yeah.
But what was imposed on them was, I would argue, disproportionate for Greece. And the results were utterly... I mean, when half the young people are out of work, what do you think happens to hope? What do you think happens to centrist politics? It just evaporates.
Amazing.
Run.
Cool. Thank you so much, Paul. Bye.
I'm not going to come with you.